Thank you for being here. And today we're joined by Dr. Daryl Joseph. Uh, Daryl, if it's okay if I use your first name. Daryl is the director for the Institute of Native Serving Educators. He's an assistant professor of special education in the Educational Specialties Department at the College of Education at Northern Arizona University. Very interesting background in terms of his research. He's really focused on the intersection of disability with sociocultural differences that inform educational inequities for American Indian and Alaska Native youth. So you could tell by his brief bio there that he cues up very well with our project and our project goals. We're speaking, in virtually every session we have had so far around the inequities that exist in our communities and helping our faculty members and their partner students create assignments that will bring these inequities to light, raise awareness, if you will. So that's where we're going to go today. Daryl and I have worked out a slightly different model than what we've used before. Instead of sort of an interview format, Daryl's going to provide us with a presentation. It'll provide a lot of, believe me, a lot of fodder for discussion and thought processes as we go through this program today. I would invite anyone who's interested in posing a question to use the chat box. I will be monitoring that as the program goes forward, and I can bring those questions to Daryl when the time's appropriate. So, Daryl, thank you so much for taking up your time to join us this afternoon and to share your expertise with us. So, I always start with the first question of why. Why this topic and what brought you to this field of study?
Thank you, Larry. I think that's a great place to start. The why will obviously go through the presentation, but my understanding it from the discussions with Larry is, as faculty, this project is to support faculty in understanding how to better bring together the content we provide in our instructional material with the knowledge of our Indigenous students that serve so that they can persist in these higher education settings, particularly as it relates to STEAM education. And so, as we think about that, obviously, as we go through the presentation today, I encourage faculty to think about, understanding the concepts that I present from both a micro and a macro lens. And when I say micro, I encourage you to think about the direct engagement you have with students generally, and then with students who are Indigenous, and in relation to a particular tribal community within the state of Arizona and obviously across the nation. I think that's really important just because as we go through the presentation, through that lens, we create space and understanding and an opportunity for students to have voice as we engage in those micro spaces. Then I also encourage you to think, more macro around these concepts as we think about navigating the systems of education, right? And what that has meant historically for Native American communities and students in particular, as we think about the history related to our shared history around the development of our nation as the U.S. And the relationship that has to these stories of historical trauma. But on the other end of it is we also have stories of resilience.
Hmm.
And so as we think about, the why, I encourage you all to kind of move between those spaces of micro and macro in understanding opportunities that are presented when we develop a lens that shapes our opportunities to really make education culturally responsive and sustaining for Indigenous students.
Marvelous. Thank you.
Okay, So let's, if Larry, if it's okay, I'll go ahead and get started with the
Please
presentation.
do. Thank you,
Okay.
Daryl.
So the title of my presentation, as Larry said, I'm an assistant professor, just recently promoted to associate within the last month. I don't know the protocols around using that title until it's officially done in the fall semester. But I'm very proud of that. And the work that I've done over time has really stemmed from my lived experience growing up in a community, as a rural community of Hopi, and then pursuing higher education. And through that, really understanding how to leverage the assets that I had as a cultural being, and also to understand how that engages within these spaces. So I think about that as an opportunity to empower Indigenous youth, um, and understand that, as faculty, we all have responsibility to think about equity in education, for all students, and then also thinking about, as Indigenous communities go, that there's a unique sovereign political status that tribal nations have, who are invested in this idea of nation building. And so I'm going to move to the next slide here. So, what I want to do is ask those of you who have the ability to use the chat box now to do an introduction. Share with me who you are, where you're coming from, what it is that you're teaching in your classes, and any tidbits that you think I'd like to learn from you. So the question here in my language of Hopi is Itam Hakak Ankh. Where do we come from? And I start this way because I think, for me, really the value of developing relationality in all my classes that I teach is very significant. I think as faculty, we understand and know that creating those direct relationships, to understand students who come into our classroom is a really meaningful opportunity for us to build their persistence and thrive in the settings of education. And as we think about that, we understand that students come from diverse perspectives, diverse experiences that may be very different from ours. And so, with that, I want to introduce myself and my language and give you a little bit of background. I hope that as we're doing this, you can also share that through the chat box. I have to figure out how to access chat here in a bit, but I'll do that in a little while here. So, ne pahasompi yan matiwa, pa ne mungkangaka, pa ne iswangwa pa ma sino ank, pa ne tuba city bu et te tukai ke pa etana pam ne wangwa pa etanga pam bu pa iswangwa, bu ne mungka pi ank. So what I said in my language is, I have two Hopi names. One is Silla, which is what you see here. And then another one is Buhusumpi, which means spider weaving a new web. Silla is the one I'm commonly referred to when I go home into the village of Munkapi, which is in the picture here. You'll see it to the upper right-hand corner of that picture. And you'll see down below there the captions. Silla means one who breathes in the snow. So if you can imagine having a snowball and you bring it to your mouth and you're sucking it in, right? And so, as we all do, we have those sisters and cousins who tease and make jokes of anything they can when you're related in that way. And I have a sister who, rather than the eloquent description I provided about breathing in the snow, she calls me Slurp. So funny story there. So I grew up in this village, Munkapi Village, and for those of you who may not know, it's a small village about 80 miles northeast of Flagstaff, Arizona, directly south of Tuba City. Um, I went to a local high school there, public school, the Tuba City High School. My family, I have 5 beautiful children with my wife, and then 2 grandchildren, and then my parents both grew up in the villages of Songopavi, which is Second Mesa region, and then my mother's from Munkapi, which is the picture you see here. My education really has been a story of both acquiring an indigenous lens or cultural lens of being raised in the community. As you can see, the farms here for Hopi, farming and corn is our main sustenance. So as children are raised in the Hopi community, we are taught that part of our identity is that the corn is our relative and will sustain us through life and through the challenges that we experience in life. And so the idea here is that we never lose connection or sight of the meaning behind the corn. And so attached to that are experiences with ceremony, experiences with our own shared knowledges through history about our migrations, the reasons why we do ceremony, the explanations of connections to land. We also have, you know, the languages that we have, and through language, it's really an opportunity for us to associate meaning with our lived experience in the environment that we grow up in.
Daryl,
And so, as
did
we,
I
yes,
interrupt?
yes,
So you're getting some responses in the chat, and if you
okay.
look on the upper right hand area of your screen, there should be a chat bubble.
Oh, great. Okay, yeah, yes, I got it.
I wanted to, before you go on, I wanted to go back to you. You quickly said what your name you meant. You said something of your name meaning a web or referring to a web.
Yes,
As you're now talking through where you're from, that background, which is a beautiful way to kind of provide context, it strikes me as though you have so many connections, as maybe we all do, into these communities, into your family, into the network, the fabric, and it forms a web. So I think it's a very appropriate name for you. I love it.
thank you very much, and thank you to I see Allison who introduced herself, and I also see Jen Andrews. Thank you. It's great to meet you. I've worked with a lot of OTs in my day when, as they consulted with me in the schools that I provided services in, and I currently work with those faculty members here in our college. Hello, Erica, who's teaching health and exercise science. Welcome. And so thank you so much for introducing yourself. And I see that your Cherokee name is translated to grandfather's girl.
Mm.
Um, and that is, I think, Jen indicating that. Thank you for sharing that story with me. And as you pointed out, Larry, I appreciate you recognizing the context that names bring,
Mm.
right? And with that, I move into this kind of development of understanding resilience.
Mm.
In using my language, we say Nahongvita, and in passing anyone in our villages on Hopi during engagement in various ceremonies that require persistence and the ability to just sacrifice and then overcome. We encourage each other by expressing, this term of nohongvita, and what that means to us is that we want to find the empowerment, right,
Mm.
to persist. And so I use this symbol, and some of you who are joining us today may recognize this symbol, but it's very prominent in the Hopi tribe, where we use this symbol to tell the story of our people with migration and how we've come to where we're at today, right? And the stories that come along with that. And so what you see here is this swirl at the center of it. I want to title that capital H home or big H home. And when I say big H home, I speak about that and reference that as a connection to those spaces where our primary cultural models initially shape our worldviews. Okay. So everyone on this call today, we have a big H home, right? And more likely than not, it's those home spaces with our parents or our grandparents that help inform and shape us. The next is at the outer edge of this swirl is the lowercase h home or the little h home. And these are the spaces where our secondary cultural models exist, right? And so when I talk about the story of Hopi and our migration story, we start from the center, right? And we know we're always connected to that. But as we move our way through this migration, what occurs is we start to engage with multiple cultural contexts,
Mm.
right? Now, if we were to flip this and say, well, let's think about our students for a moment, right? We could say that in a similar way for our students that they're coming from these big H home communities to us in the university setting or college settings, and they're being exposed to these little H home cultural contexts.
Mm.
So, what does that mean for the students, right? What does it mean for them to understand the skills, the traits, the languages, the stories they have that would facilitate factors of persistence for them? And so, as we think about this, and that work is going on, then we introduce this concept of community and history, right? That for us to persist between these spaces of capital or big H home and little h home, we're going to need a sense of community, a sense of belonging,
Mm.
right? And as we're doing this work, there's a responsibility from that big H home space and that little h home space to come together, right? Now, what's critically important for Indigenous students, excuse me, is this historical component to understand the framing of education and the relevance of it for Indigenous students. Without going into all the detail, the reality of shared stories and shared history around education for Indigenous communities is a very traumatic, sad story around
Mm.
forced assimilation by sending children to boarding schools, right?
Mhm.
With the intent of mainstreaming our community members into a Western culture. And so when we look at history, with the coming of colonization, we speak about things like genocide, speak about things like forced relocation. Um, and then we start to think about on this macro level, systemically, we start to analyze the disparities that exist, the inequities that exist, right? So the more we understand history in relation to students navigating these spaces, the more critically we are informed to ask the right questions, to develop the right approaches, pedagogies in our teaching, to bring the funds of knowledge of our students together with what the content instruction we're providing them.
Mm.
And so we're creating a both and approach.
Do you mind a question here,
No, I don't. Please do.
Harold? So it strikes me that as one moves on this path and then begins, you talked about the large H kind of being the core grounding, I'll call it the foundation of who I am and my family unit, such. And then they move sort of into this larger world where you have community and history. Do you address in an open way the shared trauma of? I mean, it must inform this path. How do you do that?
That's a really good question. So, and I'll actually get to that on the next slide,
Okay.
because as we think about this, one of the things I want to stress is that we're not isolating, um, isolating and diverging from the inclusive approach of presenting this information, right? So we're not just focusing on Indigenous students, but we're focusing on all students,
mm,
and understanding the diversity that exists within that.
mm,
Because as we start to acknowledge these components in our students, we start to see that they're bringing in stories of existence, meaning behind why they're in college in our classrooms, right? And as our colleague, Dr. Brian Brayboy, shares with us, he thinks of this idea of, that we're not simply telling our stories, but rather they're clearly showing that for many Indigenous peoples, stories serve as the basis for how our communities work,
mm, mm,
right? So when we're bringing those stories of how our communities work, then our job is to facilitate opportunities that what they're learning as will have a direct impact back to our community. So taking that further, as you asked, Larry, like how do we have this conversation? Right? And I phrased this slide as your journey, your positionality. And this is I think, one of the most valuable um, steps that I've used in the past with my students, and with faculty as we're presenting this to faculty, is to really position ourselves to ask, what has our journey been? What is our positionality? And I think we all know as faculty, when we develop research, it's really very important that we are very aware of our positionality, right? Particularly when we're collecting data, interpreting data, et cetera, to account for bias that exists.
mm,
And so, in that same manner, when we're teaching in the classroom, we must be asking those same things. Who are we? What do we bring into the classroom? What is our positionality? So that when we go to our students, we start to value and acknowledge, that we're bringing these stories together. And how I like to frame this is that if we remove the layers of ourselves, right, we start to peel the layers back to say, I'm peeling off the layer of, identifying as Hopi. I'm peeling off the layer as identifying as an Indigenous person. You start to peel all these layers, and then at the core, you get to the very foundation of just being a human being, right? That human dimension. And if we think about that human dimension, we find relationality across these dynamics of knowing we all have sacred histories. We all have languages. We all have a connection or story that's connected to a particular place. And then we all have these traditions or ceremonies,
mm,
right? So, in that framework, we start to develop some relationality. We also start to identify those unique traits that make us who we are,
mhm.
that can then be honored, and expressed. Right?
Those traits are sometimes the things we're most proud of because they make us a little bit unique in this great big world with all of these people. It's the specialness of kind of who we are.
Yes, exactly. And it also gives us the opportunity to transcend those social constructs of identity.
Mm,
Right. So my background has been working in the disability field for quite a while now. And we often talk about the social construct of disability, right? And we use this idea that, traditionally it has been framed as a deficit approach,
mhm,
right? And so if we start to peel back again from that, then we start to see that, hey, listen, you know what? We're constructing these identities socially, but if we get back to the basics of who we are as human beings, we can do a better job of focusing on our relationships to one another as human beings rather than looking at it as what we don't or what's absent from the person,
mm,
right? Based on and sometimes that's informed by our biases, right? And so I guess what I'm saying here is that sometimes we need to put ourselves as faculty in a position that we're growing our own awareness that we have bias,
Mm.
and the ways that we address those biases is critically important, particularly in this case if we're thinking about how to better serve Indigenous students. Because the tensions do exist, right? If I refer back to the migration swirl, tensions exist when we're doing this movement between big H home and little h home communities, right? Because those environmental contexts shift, they change, right? And so, as it relates to the schools and the classrooms we all participate in, it's asking the critical question of what does that mean for the student?
It
Right?
strikes me also the danger of us generalizing labels on people,
Yes,
generalizing label of a disability onto someone, and all of the baggage and all of the bias that that brings on to us. We're already working at a deficit almost because we haven't allowed for that natural story of who is the individual at the core.
yes, exactly. Thank you for sharing that, Larry. I think just before I move on to the next slide, like asking that question of who we are.
Mm.
Um, some families are, I think, very well situated and are aware and understand to say, when I take my daughter or my son and they're going back into the school system, they're equipped with the knowledge and the tools to find their voice, right?
Mm.
So that when they're doing things like you see in the pictures here, this is my wife and our two younger daughters here in our cornfield, right? Like, who is going to know unless you have that awareness that when they go back into the classroom, that this is what they were participating in over the weekend. Think about the knowledge that can be informed around STEAM education with cultivating seeds, talking about the life cycle of plants, right? About the water cycles to harvest. And so, if we're not acknowledging those stories that students bring in, we're missing out on a huge opportunity here, right?
Mm.
So, moving forward, I think a really valid and important question is to ask this of ourselves. As we engage in the work of education, in what ways do we engage relationality, right, in order to support Indigenous students to thrive in their pursuit of education? It's a very important consideration, particularly as we think about the historical ramifications of traditional forms of education for Native American communities. Right? Fast forward from the 1700s, 1800s, past the boarding school experiences into now the um, into 2025. We're here. Boarding schools have shifted; they no longer exist the way they have. Right? We're conflating and having this continuum of movement of our students between spaces of this big H home and little h home, that it's not a static process. Students are moving back and forth between these spaces. And so, for them to thrive, it's really important that we think about how we're understanding that as it relates to some of these more systemic factors of informing our health outcomes and the well being of our communities.
Daryl, is it your observation that some cultures are more, um, I don't know, I'm going to say the word valued or more recognized in our educational systems and not so much others, um, so that students, some students may feel alienated because their background, their history, all of the things you're referencing aren't appreciated or aren't recognized. they're again maybe overgeneralized or they're labeled in a way that doesn't serve that student well.
Well, most definitely. I think we need to understand, and I think about this all the time. Like I work in pre-service education, right, in the college I'm in, and I'm training our youth to be our future educators,
Mm,
right? And I can tell you, probably 95% of the students who come into my class are going to be female, white, cisgendered populations.
mm,
Um, we have male lack of male representation generally. And
mm,
then when I talk about Indigenous students, we have a lack of that representation. And so when I think about the teachers that I'm preparing to go into the classrooms, I wonder, and think about exactly that question. What is their knowledge and experience around Indigenous context? Do they know that in Arizona there are 22 federally recognized tribes? Do they know that in the United States there are 576 federally recognized tribes? Do they know that it's not a homogenized culture of Native Americans, but that each one of these communities have their unique languages and identities, right?
mm,
And so when you go back to looking at our educational system, we don't do a good job of representing those perspectives
mm,
um, for students and bringing awareness to that. So as you come into the classroom, we have more of this standardized, normative understanding of a mainstream culture, right?
mm,
And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but it does create inequities for our
mm,
students when you have experiences that may not be represented,
mm.
right? It creates isolation. We start to identify the challenges and barriers that exist in the experiences for students who come from diverse communities.
Daryl, and I'm sorry. I know I promised I was going to save my questions, but you're stimulating a lot of thoughts because I'm focused on this issue of inequities. What is the effect on those students who are now perhaps marginalized? I show up into one of your education classes, and I may be one or maybe two representing my culture, my let's just say the indigenous culture. Do is there a what happens in that student's mind then? Do they want to then reflect out and try to look like and behave like and act like others so that they fit in?
Really good question. Yeah, that's a good question. And I would, perhaps also bounce that question back to the faculty who
Mm,
are joining us today, to respond to that, because I think there's a continuum of
mm,
effects that can occur. Right?
mm,
I think one, and I've had these experiences where students, because the influence of the lower H home spaces have been so strong, and the space for big H home in that academic environment is very limited, that students will sometimes conform and assimilate, right? And leave behind the assets that they have with them, and not use them as tools to persist in higher ed.
mm,
But we also have students who are very well informed, and almost take a position of resistance and asserting their positionality,
yeah.
to incorporate their own experience and their stories into these settings. And so I don't think there's one, you know, um, outcome of that. I think it's a continuum of experiences, and it really is reflective of our ability to observe and respond to that as faculty. I see someone's hand up.
Yeah, not a question so much as I just kind of wanted to say that internally you were talking about biases and kind of what that looks like in some of what was just being talked about. And one of the things that was really interesting to me when I was redoing our healthcare and culture class, and as I was doing a lot of the research for it, just the idea that Indigenous populations are often viewed of as historical and in the past. And it was really interesting to me because the previous person who had done the class, who was the department chair, very smart, I respected her so much. Even the pictures that she put up for Native American healthcare and culture were pictures that were in black and white from so long ago.
Yes.
And so that's one of the things that I have really been trying hard to really just that, in terms of you were talking about are some cultures represented maybe more favorably than others, or so to speak, but like that Indigenous populations are frequently, when you think about who are our doctors, who are our lawyers, who are our teachers, that for so many people, Indigenous people don't come to mind when you think about that. And that when you do ask people, in fact, the Harvard implicit bias test, which I know has a lot of faults and whatnot, it's not perfect, but you think of cowboys and Indians and black and white photos, and it's interesting because even my own cousin, she is the art curator for the Virginia Museum of Modern Arts, and she is over the Indigenous art. And we were at the Heard Museum a couple of weeks ago, and one of her big goals is to look at art from today, from our Indigenous artists today.
Yes.
And so even in my own classes, that's something that I really try hard to bring up, is that we are alive and we are here today.
Yes. Yes. Jen, I appreciate your perspective on that. And you, to a T, presented a principle that within a tool that I'll share later in this presentation, to think about, like, what are the ways that we might be unintentionally perpetuating those perspectives of the past, or those perspectives of the intention of assimilation in Western education for Native students, right? How do we move past that? And so I want to share a little bit about that, because what you're speaking about is this idea of culturally sustaining and responsive education. But before I go there, I think it's also really important that, because I also do research in various aspects of health. I work on a grant looking at using mobile health technology to address the mental health of Indigenous youth. I also have a research project with the American Cancer Society to increase the cancer screening rates among Native American women for breast and cervical cancer screening. And this conversation often comes up, and it's intimately linked to education, right? And some of you may be aware of the public health model of the SDOH, the SDOH. And generally, what we say using this model from a public health domain is that if we have the greater access we have to these items listed here, and the increased quality that's there, we have increased greater positive health outcomes for our communities. Okay. So generally looking at this makes sense, right? Good economic stability, having a neighborhood and physical environment that provides these resources, access to good education, food, that community social context, and in our healthcare systems, right? So that's generally speaking about our national population. Now, if I were to ask the question, and please use your chat box if you feel you would like to, if I were to ask you, what can be added to this model to increase its relevance for Indigenous communities? What would you suggest we add to this? Think about that. What would we add to this?
Do you know what I saw as missing as you
Yes.
were going through this? It just struck me, and I don't know where or how it would fit, but self, the individual of who they are, all of the things you spoke of, Daryl, earlier, is nowhere represented on. Well, social integration maybe, but community engagement, but recognizing and supporting the individual.
Yes. A sense of self and connection to community. Jen, I'm going to hold off yet just because I know I always do this. Like I run out of time and I want to be sure we get to that the tool I want to share with you. So if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you either to share in the chat or we'll open it up at the very end. Thank you, Jen. I appreciate that. So as we think about that, we must consider a few things, right? So let's look at the inequities and disparities that exist. For example, economic stability. We know median household income, there's disparities between our American Indian, Alaska Native populations and non-Hispanic whites. Education, health, right? We're going through this right now. My father is elderly, requiring more services, and when he's receiving services from the Indian Health Services, um, and does not have the access to private insurance the way that I do as being a faculty member, I'm seeing the disparities presenting themselves, right? And so we know that it's going to impact the well-being of our Indigenous nations as we scale this out to a larger population of our community members, right? So as we think about this, we must think about the absence of those factors specifically related to tribal communities that we must start to incorporate, such as health traditions. Yes, thank you, Jen. So the next thing that I want to share with you is as we're doing this work, when we're serving that student in our classroom, right, that is coming from an Indigenous community. As I stated earlier, there are 22 tribes in Arizona that are federally recognized. And what that means for these tribes is that they are also very driven by developing goals and priorities to build a healthy nation for the well-being of that community. Right? And so when we say Indigenous nation building, they're concerned with things like governance, asserting sovereignty, developing their self-determination, identifying and developing institutions within their community, sustaining their language and culture, right? And the list goes on. And then the things that might be missing from the SDOH model are things that are here. You know, we know there's a disparity in income. Our educational systems within our communities, the cultural continuity, the idea and representation of colonialism, right? So the list goes on there. So when we think about really understanding these frameworks and bringing them together with good intention, we can promote the health and well-being of our tribal nations, knowing that the students we're serving, if they're identifying concerns and issues on a project in your class that's intimately linked back to their community, we're contributing to nation building, right, for those communities. And what happens there successfully impacts the broader community, right? So it's all related to one another. So here's another example of that. So at an individual level, when we speak about students, you know, risk factors they may experience are access to resources, right? Representation, being separated from families, moving from that big H home to a little H home. This value of individualism, if you're coming from a community context into an institution, we really drive home the point that you got to be self-motivated, right? You got to take the initiative. Um, you know, so that list goes on, and then we talk about, well, what are some of these protective those macro protective factors. Those are things like parents, sense of belonging, ability, history, etc. And at the student level, we want to ask those questions of what are their goals? How is their independence informed? Is it connected to community, right? What are those stories of migration? What are their stories of resilience? How are they represented? Where's their language? How's history represented? If we understand those things in relation to each other, then what we're doing is supporting this idea of this concepts of relationships, responsibility, reciprocity, and redistribution, right? And we're contributing to nation building. And if we do it well, what we're actually doing, and I like to tell the students this, is that is where you find your superpower. Finding your superpower and understanding what we're faced with in terms of those risk factors, those disparities and inequities. Acknowledge them, yes, but let's not stop there, right? Let's also identify the strengths that we're bringing with us, and let's facilitate that so that we can give back to our nations. So the next thing here is, what we're talking about there is developing agency. Okay, developing agency. So that we can express a form of self-determination, so we can express our sovereignty, use our indigenous knowledge to contribute to nation building. And I use this picture because it's a representation of my community. This is a picture of 19 men in our community who were held captive by the government for resisting to implement Western forms of agriculture and also education. Right? They were coming into our communities and taking our students to send them to residential boarding schools, and these men resisted that. And so they were the first prisoners of Alcatraz. But the story to this, if you continue and follow it, is everything we're talking about agency. Their experience informs me and where I'm at now. Because what came out of that was this message of kayet Peemusenam amangam lavai wisni. Say that again. Amautu kaya peemusenam amangam lavai wisni. And what they learned from this experience was, you go and get an education. You learn the way the white man thinks, speaks, writes. So that when you do that, you can come back and advocate and work for your people. Protect your people. This is about survivance, a very real time of surviving, right? Fast forward, many of our tribal communities still tell our youth to do this. Get an education because you're going to contribute to nation building. We need you. And so as we think about that, it's bringing in some very real ideas around understanding that culture, knowledge, and power take on new meaning when it's examined through an indigenous lens, right? We also know that governmental policies and educational policies are intimately linked around this problematic goal of assimilation. And then we're also knowing that these stories are not separate. They actually are forms of theory. And I think that's a very big one, especially in STEAM education, where we're asking students to identify theoretical representations of the topic, concepts we're learning about, to support the ideas and justify and argue for, right? And the resources we're going to go to are those that we find in the library, but you're not going to find those resources, those stories, those theories from an indigenous knowledge in that library. You're going to find it from the stories of the elders. And that's oral history there. And so in that sense, those stories are real and legitimate sources of data and ways of being. So we have to honor, acknowledge that as faculty to create space for that in our classrooms. Let's see here. How much time do we have? About 5 minutes? 10
we're
minutes?
flexible. Yeah, Daryl. As long as you have the time, we're flexible. So please don't rush.
Okay. So I think, going from where we've talked about, we've talked some about the our positionality, our journeys, understanding our sense of place as faculty members going into the classroom. Where do we find the relationships between ourselves and our students? We've talked about this idea of nation building and using models like the social determinants of health and asking the question what's missing for developing an indigenous determinants of health, right? And then we talk about agency. So through that all, we're really speaking about all these parameters around culture, right? And I like to use our colleague's quote here, and he speaks about culture as being an anchor in the ocean. Culture is tied to a group of people and often a physical place. For many Indigenous people, culture is rooted to lands on which they live, as well as their ancestors who lived on those lands before them. However, just as the anchor shifts and sways with the changing tides and ebbs and flows of the ocean, culture shifts
Mm.
and flows with the changes in context, situations, people, and purposes. Like all humans, Indigenous people are shaped by their cultural inheritance and they engage in cultural production.
Mm.
So, as we were speaking of, as Dr. Andrews brought up a little earlier, not thinking about Indigenous people as in the past, we need to think about them as in the contemporary context. Dr. Brayboy here is saying that it shifts. We shifts in response to our environmental context, the interaction between the little H and the big H home communities. So as we're moving through that, understanding that we can't associate that constructed identity to students based on sometimes a premise of, this black and white notion of Indigenous communities. Very important. And so as we think about that, we want to bring in the funds of knowledge of our students. And as we do that, we're also really contributing to the idea that this is the health and well-being of our next generation, right, of youth. So as part of that, there are some examples here, I think, that are really telling of conditions that differ between the big H home and little H home communities, the languages that we use, right? In our Indigenous communities, there may be 54 different ways to say give, right? Different ways to represent that, actions to represent that. When we speak about giving in a academic and professional vocabulary, right, we're talking probably about production, right? Meeting deadlines, etc. Capital H home, there's this flexibility of how you learn. This is how I learned to do it versus because the book says so. Right? These cultural protocols versus academic protocols, timelines when everyone is ready versus 10 a.m. sharp, co-creation versus observing how a person moves through the space, right, and making an interpretation from that, and telling your story versus getting to the point. Very linear versus a circular orientation of presenting a message. So very important considerations as we think about how to incorporate and develop our pedagogies that offer opportunities for our Indigenous students to bring in these knowledges and leverage the content we're presenting to them so that they can create this both and perspective. In the work that I've done in the past, or that I'm doing now as director for the Institute for Native Serving Educators, the background there is that we at NAU, we have a program, the I&E program, which sponsors professional development for in-service teachers in K-12 settings. And what we do is we invite faculty, and they can come from any one of our colleges on campus. It can be forestry, it can be biology, the humanities, social sciences, and we ask them to give relevant, up-to-date information on literature that is relevant to building community. Then we invite teachers to identify how those topics are relevant to the standards they teach, and then present it back to their students in a culturally sustaining and responsive way. And so from years of doing that work since 2018, myself and colleagues looked at these curriculum units that were being developed. We looked at the current literature and research that's out there to think about providing guidelines for educators to be more culturally responsive to their students. And this is what we came up with. Let's see. So the citation is there. So when you get the PowerPoint, you can easily find this and access the article. But we call it the CRAZE tool, Culturally Responsive Assessment of Indigenous Schooling. And through our work, we've identified 5 different domains that you see here. Under each domain are principles that reflect those general categories. And so let's say that you're developing your syllabus and you're thinking about incorporating, textbooks, stories, guest presenters, and you're developing your pedagogy, your practice, your steps to teach that. We invite educators to apply these principles to the extent applicable, and really ask these questions around, how well am I engaging with developing relationality, relationships, and communities? And I might ask myself, do my activities, my reading materials, encourage students to understand themselves within broader communities? Right? If we're looking at Indigenous knowledge systems and languages, how are traditional and our cultural knowledges included? Right? If we're looking at those social political contexts, are we recognizing Indigenous communities as Native nations or governmental agencies? How are we representing Indigenous people? And this, exactly to your point, Jen, here it is. Indigenous people are represented as contemporary and not only historical, right? Critical understandings of diversity and specifically race, like we actively work to counter stereotypes of Indigenous people and our communities. And so this provides, a lot of that guidance for us to move through the space in bridging those big H and little h home communities. Here is the tool. If you have a phone, you can scan that QR code. It'll be in the recording. But this is actually what it looks like. And if you're in a position to do so, we also invite you to score yourself. 0 meaning that you're doing neither promoting it or perpetuating some of these principles, or 1 meaning yes, you're really increasing your opportunities to be more culturally responsive, from a degree of 1, 2, and 3, versus you're countering some of these principles more in a negative context. So I want to share that with you. Lastly, well, and I'll leave it here because we're just about out of time. I think when we talk about STEAM education, really, as faculty across all our colleges and departments, we're wanting to create equitable opportunities, right? And when we're doing that for Indigenous students, we're leveraging those knowledges, right? Because it really frames the way that culture and Indigenous knowledge inform protective factors. And as we understand as schools and institutions, we're constantly trying to facilitate ways to do that, identify those protective factors for students. And there are those factors that are really unique for Indigenous students around the languages and the cultures that they come from. Also, as we said earlier from Brayboy, that these policies in education are linked to assimilation, right? And if we're being intentional and aware of our positionality and trying to bridge these spaces, it's about creating these relational ways of engaging as relatives, as allies, to enhance our context, right? To develop these both and approaches. And as a result, we all are contributing to the health and well-being of those tribal communities, and also largely our macroculture of the US, right? And together we're supporting one another. So I'm going to leave it there. I know we're out of time, but I can stick around for any questions that might come up or anyone wants to present.
I see that. Yeah, thank you, Daryl. Is coming in on the chat there. Robin says thank you.
Oh,
I
thank
add
you.
my voice to that as well. Jen, any reflections or questions for Daryl from your perspective?
Yes, I always have questions. That's just me. One of my questions, one of the things that I was thinking of, and I've often wondered this, and I don't, is that Indigenous populations, African American populations, there's literature that shows that there's that lack of trust, that those that towards the healthcare system, and I've often wondered um, how much is that still at play, and how we get past that, both in the educational setting, the healthcare setting, I mean any setting. But then the other question that I guess is a little bit more personal is when you have somebody like me who kind of straddles both sides. I don't look Native American, I don't talk with any sort of accent, but it was what I was raised with. It's how I identify. And so I have this deep love and appreciation, but I don't look it. And so how do we help? I mean, yes, we as providers and as educators can help to bridge the gap by doing the things that you were just talking about, but also um, is that enough to bridge? Is that enough to get past that distrust that just comes from the history?
Yeah, I don't have an absolute resolve for that. I think my experience and perspectives have, I understand where, like, the question around distrust around systems, institutions, organizations, healthcare systems, it exists and it's real, right? And when we think about our tribal communities, part of the reason being is because of this trait of being invisible as being represented in these conversations, right? And I think that's the challenge that we have at the moment. I think the other thing that we have to consider is generationally, we're not too far removed from the boarding school era, right?
No,
We
I have
have those, yeah, we have those experiences. We have grandparents, we have parents who have still live through those traumatic experiences and create a lot of those perceptions of distrust around systems.
I have living
And
family members who were down at Indian school.
yep, so when we think about that, then what does it mean for critically addressing that through our educational processes? If we're not addressing that, then we're not creating the space to have the conversation. And I think that's one of the most powerful things we can do as faculty members, is to find an opportunity to develop a connection through a human presence, right? To say, how do we value one another through our histories? Some of it is not so pretty. Yes, that's a fact. It's not so pretty, but it is a reality, right? How do we share the parameters around languages, around connection to land, and then also our ceremonies and traditions. We all have those things. And so if we start to create space that allows for comfort and safety, we're creating opportunities for individuals to ask these very sensitive questions. But as faculty, we have to respond to that, right? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges right now, particularly in our current climate. I think everyone's asking themselves, can we say this? Can we say that? Right? And I tell my educators who are going to be teachers in a few years from now, I said, you find strength through your relationships. That means that your responsibility is to directly know who your students are, know who their families are, connect to those families, and respect and understand their diversity that exists within that. You're developing trust within that space. The challenge with that is that you'll find comfort and safety within that space if we do it well, but we're working within systems, right? And so at these larger macro levels, though, that's the challenging space. And we need to do that through community. And it's not an easy job, and it's not going to be easy for the next few more years to do. But we can't lose sight of that. We can't lose sight of our human connections to one another, because the intentions we have for growing healthy, creating well-being for our sense of selves, means that we have to respect our history, to hopefully break down those barriers around the sense of distrust among our community members, right? And I think also for non-Indigenous faculty, and I say it here too, that we're relatives, we're allies, right? We're community members. There's not an either or way of doing this. It has to be a both and approach, right? Because we're related to one another as human beings. So how do we do this work together? And I think, that's really like, I think a philosophical response to that. But within that, I think if we're doing the work and we're intentional about it, we can find the strategies within that message.
Thank you. It definitely is. I feel like sometimes in upper education, adjunct or faculty, whatnot, you have a little bit more freedom to kind of be able to do some things, but especially like I'm thinking of, the special ed process and eligibility and how do we determine goals and things like that. I mean, even standardized assessments,
Mm-hmm.
the Indigenous representation for a standardized assessment is like close to nil. And so, you're comparing these children to, even to have access to have these, new and up and coming standardized assessments get standardized, you have to have access to those. And who has access? White, middle, upper class children.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah,
it's,
I could talk all day and do another presentation on special education, and I think but I want to say that in response to that, like there's a level of empowerment we have to engage in to speak up and have a voice to represent those communities, right? And understand that the tools we utilize, curriculum in this case, standardized testing in this case, is not a one size fits all approach, right? And if we're developing these relationships and really understanding those that we're working with, then we can identify opportunities to integrate, recognizing the strengths and assets that those students are bringing into the classroom. And I say that because even as an Indigenous person, I have bias in myself where I think just because I'm Indigenous, I have everything I need to go into Indigenous populations and serve them well. That's not the case, right? I went into my community when I first completed my degree as a special ed teacher, and I thought, man, the university really equipped me well to be a good special educator, and they did. I observed, I assessed, I diagnosed, I did referrals, I did that very well. I created transition plans for our high school students to transition out of high school setting into those post-secondary settings using mainstream frameworks until a grandmother came to me, spoke to me in the Hopi language with her granddaughter. She was the caretaker or guardian of her granddaughter. And when I presented all these plans, it included community college, it included university settings, employment on Hopi, off Hopi, in border town communities. Like everything I thought needed to be there was there. The grandmother turned around and said, Mr. Joseph, I don't want anything that has to do with this. What I want you to do is I want you to use your program to train our granddaughter to be the firekeeper of our village home. And that blew me away because everything she said just in that one simple statement, I could accomplish the outcomes of independent living, employment, training, and education by being a firekeeper because she was being given a home. Independent living was taken care of. She was going to be in lifelong training to be a firekeeper. And then we had a cultural economy that was independent employment for her. So sometimes it's about shifting the ways that we think and being creative with applying the practices that are there, the structures that are there to fit the needs of the community.
I love
So,
that. Thank you for
yes.
sharing. I will say too, and this will be my last comment, is that even at the big level, in a couple of weeks I'm going to the AOTA conference in Philadelphia, and there's a 3-hour seminar on culturally safe inclusion of Indigenous identity, and that's the first time I've seen that at the national level for my own practice, and so of course that's number one on my list to go
Great.
to. So
Great.
yeah,
Thank you.
Well, Daryl, thank you very much. Maybe I would second your thought. We could probably go on for a couple more hours, but we've really enjoyed this conversation, this dialogue. You've opened my mind up to so many aspects of education at all levels, and I think how I reflect back, maybe unfortunate it is that we have not always recognized and appreciated the stories of each individual and how to use those stories of their communities and their connections and their history and their traditions in a way that advances that student. We've in many cases, we've not asked, we've not thought about it. And in many cases, the students who may be underrepresented aren't given a chance. I love the way you talk about opening the space, and that's a concept I'll take away from this as well. So with that, as I mentioned, we have a small group with us today, but the rest will be invited to watch it. I thank you so much for sharing from your heart and from your knowledge of your work, and I'm certain it's going to influence the outcomes of our project.
Thank you for the invitation, Larry. It's a pleasure to meet all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a good night or day.